Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. So I'm going to give an overview of work I've done, I guess, really over the last 5 or 10 years on the overall theme of flow instabilities in complex fluids. I've divided this talk into 3 parts. The first one, I'm actually going to give a very sort of basic pedagogical introduction even to complex fluids and to complex flows. Actually looking around the audience, that's probably going to be redundant for many of you, so you should take a light doze in the sun for the first 5 or 10 minutes. But I did that because I'm aware that there is quite a broad range of people at this meeting, and so it seems sensible to gather everyone together at least to start with. Having introduced the basic idea of complex fluids and the idea of flow instabilities, I'm then going to talk about work I've done separately on instabilities that crop up when complex fluids are subject to a shear flow. And I'll then talk about instabilities in extensional flow. Actually, there'll be a slightly different feeling of the pace to these two, because in this first one, I'm going to give, in a way, a sort of potted overview of several different pieces of work at a very sort of broad level. And then in the second one, I'll really dive into the calculational detail, take the gloves off, and at a level I would present a talk, say, at a Society of Rheology meeting. Okay, so complex fluids then, as I think most of us know here, really. We're talking here about things like surfactants, liquid crystals, polymers, foams, emulsions and colloids. Find a very broad range of applications, both in nature and in technology. And the unifying feature common to all of them is the presence of internal mesoscopic substructures, typically on the scale of nanometers to microns. So we may think of long rod-like molecules, for example, in a liquid crystal, or long chain-like molecules in a polymer. And the presence of these internal structures confers on these properties rather striking material properties that we don't see in conventional hard matter, such as a crystalline solid, for example. The most obvious of which, of course, as the name suggests, is that they're soft under an imposed shear flow. So if we imagine taking a polymeric fluid, for example, we have lots of long chain-like polymer molecules in there that are rather easily deformed. There are just entropic forces resisting this, so the energy scale is kT as compared to the strong bonds that hold together hard matter. So they're soft under shear. And then 3 other striking material properties that I'll talk through. Actually, does anyone have a laser pointer? This is a slightly cumbersome. Could I borrow a bit too long to be waving around somehow? I'll carry on talking, really. Thank you. Oh, thanks very much. Thank you. Thank you. There we go. Okay, so 3 other striking material properties then that I'll talk through on the next 3 slides in turn. The first one, so-called viscoelasticity, closely connected with that, the fact that these materials are quite easily driven into nonlinear flow states, and following on from that, the fact that it's quite easy to drive them through transitions as a function of applied flow. So viscoelasticity then, so if we take our slab of polymeric fluid then, and at some time 0 we suddenly deform it, we apply a small shear strain to it, and we hold it strained for all subsequent times. The strain, of course, defined by the displacement normalised by the gap size. And then we expect some shear stress, some force per unit area at the wall to be induced that then decays on some relaxation timescale tau. And we're all used to conventional elastic solids in which that relaxation timescale is enormous and the stress effectively never decays. So an elastic solid strays stress as long as you hold it strained. And we're all used to simple liquids such as water in which the small molecules very quickly rejig themselves under Brownian motion and the stress decays essentially instantaneously. On the other hand, in these complex fluids, what we have is a very sluggish process, again, of Brownian relaxation, but now, for example, these long chain-like polymer molecules have to slowly disentangle themselves from each other, and the stress decays then on a timescale slowly that's commensurate with human observation, which typically makes these materials actually rather nice to do experiments on in the sense that the timescales are those of human beings. So now if we consider a slightly different experiment in which, so previously we thought about taking a slab of material and suddenly strain it and then holding it strained. What we're doing now is applying shear at some constant rate, so we're steadily moving the top wall at some constant rate, and then again normalised by the gap size. That wall speed over the gap size gives us a shear rate, which has the dimensions of inverse time. And then what we usually expect is that a flow field establishes that is homogeneous, so the shear rate is the spatial gradient of the velocity profile. And then typically what we do experimentally is wait for the shear stress to reach a steady state at any given applied shear rate, and then we repeat that experiment for lots of different applied shear rates, collect together the steady state shear stresses, plot the curve, and that gives us what's called a flow curve. And then typically we see 2 distinct regimes in that flow curve, depending on whether the shear rate that we're applying is either slow or fast compared to the intrinsic rate of the material stress relaxation as measured in this linear response measurement here. So if we're shearing at a very slow flow rate here, what we're doing essentially is the material's intrinsic Brownian reconfiguration dynamics of these long chain-like molecules, for example, is fast on the timescale that we're applying strain. So in other words, we're effectively just riding along on Brownian dynamics that are already there. We see a regime of linear response in which the stress is linearly related to the shear rate, the slope being the viscosity. On the other hand, when we shear it at a rate fast compared to the intrinsic relaxation timescale, we start to fundamentally alter the reconfiguration dynamics of the chains. Their intrinsic relaxation processes can't keep up with the shear that we're applying, and so we drive the system into a non-linear or so-called non-Newtonian flow regime. And actually, in many materials, we can even drive the system so hard that we drive it through a transition as a function of the applied flow rate, and that's going to be a recurring theme in what follows in the rest of the talk. So just a visual kind of smorgasbord of the different kinds of, various different kinds of flow-induced transitions that we can see in these materials. We may think of taking a liquid crystal system that's initially in an isotropic state. And then we know, of course, that if we drop the temperature, for example, or concentrate it, we can, in equilibrium, drive the system through a pneumatic transition. But we're not doing that here, we're just shearing it. And what we can see here is a shear-induced isotropic pneumatic transition. We may think of, sorry, these circles haven't reproduced very well here, but in a hard sphere colloid, we may think of driving the system into a jam state. We may think of applying shear to a surfactant lamellar phase. We've got lots of surfactant molecules here self-assembled into sheets, and then as a function of shear, they can be driven through a transition where those sheets curl up into forming concentric onion-like objects. Something that's become of interest recently in the complex fluids literature is something that's been labelled as viscoelastic turbulence. So what we're doing here is taking a polymer solution and we're shearing it actually between parallel plates here, and between circular plates. And as a function of the rate at which we're shearing it, we can see a host of transitions eventually culminating in a state that looks rather turbulent. But I should emphasize here that the Reynolds number is tiny, and so this is not conventional inertial turbulence, but a kind of turbulence that arises, on the other hand, from the intrinsically nonlinear dynamics of the way the polymer chains reconfigure themselves in flow. Something I'll talk about a lot later on is a shear banding, where we drive the material through a transition where it goes from an initially homogeneous flow state to one in which we have a coexistence of two bands. Another one I've shown here, which is actually slightly different in flavour. So what we've done here is dropped the system through a thermodynamic temperature by dropping, through a thermodynamic transition by dropping the temperature. So we have, say, oil and water here that were initially mixed together at a high temperature. We've dropped them into the region in which they want to demix. We have a process of domain coarsening, and then on top of that transition that's already taking place, we can ask about the effect of an applied shear. So as we can see then, there's really a very rich variety of transitions that we can investigate under an applied shear flow. I'm now going to talk about how we go about modelling this, and again, I think the next 2 or 3 slides are very introductory for most people here. But the basic philosophy here in modelling this is that the macroscopic flow properties on the length scales that we're interested in depend only on the dynamics at the coarse-grained level of, for example, long chain-like polymer molecules, independent of the chemical detail, for example, of whether we've got polyisoprene or polybutadiene. So, for example, in polymeric systems, we universally see the viscosity going as a power law of chain length for linear polymers, and universally going exponentially in the chain length for star polymers, independent of the chemical detail of the atoms that make up the polymer chains. Okay, so that's the basic philosophy, and so now let's proceed to put a bit of maths on that. So we all know that when modelling flow properties, we start out with something called a Navier-Stokes equation. So this is just force balance at the level of little fluid elements. Mass times acceleration is the sum of viscous forces and forces due to pressure gradients. I'm going to assume throughout also incompressible flow. And then what we need to do for these complex fluids is consider also a viscoelastic stress, as I described earlier, that arises due to the presence of these internal mesoscopic substructures. And generally that's some funny, horrible, nonlinear function of some mesostructural variables that characterize the state of structure of these mesoscopic entities within the fluid. And the identity of those variables varies according to the material and the flow regime that we're interested in. But for example, in a polymeric system, it may be the state of strain of these polymer molecules relative to some isotropic state of undeformed equilibrium. In a liquid crystalline system, it may be the pneumatic orientation tensor, which we'd call Q in that case usually. And there may be a host of other variables. For example, in a worm-like micellar surfactant system, we may have to think about the length of the worm-like micelles, a scalar property, also as being a relevant variable. And then the task for a theoretical rheologist then is to derive an equation of motion for the way in which that mesoscopic substructure, those variables, respond to an applied flow field. So we have some convective derivative and then some nonlinear function of the applied flow field and a nonlinear function of the mesostructural variable itself. And very often, in fact, those equations are nonlinear partial differential equations of a reaction diffusion type. So of interest to many of the mathematicians here at this meeting. And then there's one final mental switch that we need to make in modelling these viscoelastic fluids as compared to people from the traditional fluid mechanics literature, which is that very often we're in the regime where these viscoelastic stresses are so large compared to any inertial forces that we can effectively set we can take the limit of Stokes' creeping flow in which the inertial terms are unimportant. And to someone from the conventional fluid mechanics background, you may then think all the interesting stuff's been thrown away because, of course, it's the nonlinearity of that term, the v dot grad v term, that gives us, for example, transitions to inertial turbulence. But the point is that in these complex fluids, we can see a whole host of flow-induced transitions instead because of the inherent nonlinearity of these additional equations here that tell us about the viscoelastic stress. So in other words, the nonlinear dynamics of the way that polymer chains or liquid crystalline molecules respond to an applied flow. So I've gone through things there in very kind of generalized terms. Now let's focus in on one particular example, which has been studied a lot by the rheology community over the last 20 years. So we're concerned here with a worm-like micellar surfactant system. So in surfactants then, of course, we have a host of amphiphilic molecules, each of which has a polar head group that wants to be next to water and a non-polar tail that doesn't. And so when we put many of them into aqueous solutions, then depending on the conditions of temperature and concentration, these self-assemble into, for example, spherical objects or worm-like objects or sheets or plumber's nightmare phases. I'm concerned here today in the worm-like micellar case, so I'm not going to talk about the others any further. So if we consider then a host of lots of worm-like objects, all of which are entangled with each other, then we want to think about how these things respond to an applied flow. So we might think at first sight that we've got a horrendous nightmare of a problem to think about because we've got a large number n of worm-like objects, all of which are entangled with many others. So what we do is what any self-respecting physicist would do, which is trim an n-body problem down to a one-body problem in focusing on the dynamics of a single worm that we label and replace the others by a mean field, which then effectively acts like a tube in the sense that the points of the entanglements of this test chain with all the others form effective constraints on the lateral motion, and so the worm now can't move orthogonally to its tube tangent vector, but it can snake backwards and forwards along this tube. And so the way that it relaxes some stress then is by a process of progressively snaking backwards and forwards along this tube until it's escaped and reconfigured itself completely. That process is known as reptation, with a timescale that will denote tau sub d. And of course, actually, these dynamics you'd find even in regular polymer systems where we have long polymer molecules, each of which has its length and structure quenched at the time that it's synthesized. But the new feature in these worm-like surfactant systems is that these chain-like objects actually dynamically reversibly break and recombine. So we have another relaxation process to think about. That's a process of reaction where we see breakage and reformation of the tube along its length. And assuming that that process is fast compared to the timescale of reptation, what that effectively does is pre-average along the chain and turn what would be a whole host of relaxation timescales in a regular non-living polymer into a single stress relaxation timescale, because effectively each bit of the chain on a timescale that's long compared to this breaking and reformation looks equivalent effectively with regards the reptation process. And so all of that has been said in words, and all of that was worked through mathematically actually by Mike Cate back when he was even a postdoc, I think. And so what you can do is thinking through those microscopic processes that I talked through in words on the previous slide, is one can derive an equation of motion now for the flow properties. So we have the Stokes condition of creeping flow, as I wrote down before. The stress is then taken to depend linearly on a deformation tensor of the micelles with some constant prefactor, which is a modulus, relative to some isotropic undeformed state. That deformation tensor is then formed by taking the product of the local unit tangent vector along the chain, averaged over all the chains, and then what Mike did was effectively to derive an equation of motion for the dynamics of that deformation tensor in flow, which looks very complicated, but actually switching all this stuff off, we see that we just have relaxation in the absence of flow back onto an isotropic state. And then in the presence of flow, this tensor gets convected onto some, eventually onto some steady state that would prescribe the flow curve. And indeed, one can then use that model to compute the model's rheological properties. So if we think of our original experiment, the very simple experiment of a small amplitude step strain, applying a small strain, holding it fixed, seeing the stress generated and watching it decay exponentially. And what we find in these micellar solutions, actually in contrast to many other complex fluids, is that the stress decays in a mono-exponential way, and that's due to this fast pre-averaging along the chain, with a single relaxation timescale that's the geometric mean of the breaking and the reptation times that I talked about before. So that's the first experiment that I introduced above. The second experiment is this steady shear experiment where we're moving the top plate at a constant speed relative to the bottom one, and then the wall speed over the gap size is the shear rate. And computing the shear stress as a function of shear rate in the reptation reaction model, what we find is something that has this rather peculiar loop-the-loop shape. Now this is really rather peculiar because this is telling us that a system in this region of negative slope here, this is trying to tell us that a system that's flowing faster has less stress, and that's obviously an unstable state of affairs. So that leaves us with something of a conundrum, which actually at the end of this introductory section then leads neatly into the next section on shear banding instabilities. Okay, so shear banding then. So, hello.
You in this interval?
Okay, so it was if you draw the path of the chain along its tube, it's locally the unit tangent vector at any point along the tube. Yeah. And then you then form the product of that of average over the distribution. Okay, so shear banding then. So if we imagine doing this experiment that I talked about before, where we take a sample of complex fluids and sandwich it between parallel plates, and then we shear it by steadily moving the top plate relative to the bottom one, the usual experience, or at least the usual assumption that's made in the rheological literature, is that the flow field that establishes looks like this. So it's homogeneous in the sense that the shear rate, which is the spatial gradient of the velocity profile, so these vectors show the speed to which the fluid is moving, with which the fluid is moving to the right at any height across the cell. So the assumption would be that the shear rate, which is a spatial gradient of this velocity, is uniform across the gap. But actually in very many complex fluids, it turns out that life isn't so simple, and instead the system goes through a transition and separates into a state of two coexisting bands, a high shear rate and a low shear rate. And then because we know that the state of flow in a complex fluid is coupled to the state of mesoscopic, the arrangement of these mesoscopic substructures, the separation in shear rate then also leads to a separation in terms of the structural entities, these mesostructural entities inside the fluid. So for example, in worm-like micellar surfactants, the high shear band tends to have, the worms inside it tend to be pneumatically aligned with the flow as compared with isotropic in the low shear band. Similarly in liquid crystalline suspensions, in so-called onion surfactants, where we have these surfactant sheets that have rolled up into onion structures, the ordering isn't orientational as it is in this case, but is rather translational. So we have a translational order of onions here and disorder here. And actually, so when I first started working in shear banding about 10 or 15 years ago, it had been seen experimentally in worm-like micellar surfactants and in a few other systems as well. But actually, really, one of the nice things about working in this field over the last decade has been that the experimentalists have progressively demonstrated, really, that almost any complex fluid you could care to mention, whether it's a surfactant or a liquid crystal or an emulsion or a foam or anything, I mean, really almost ubiquitously this crops up in the complex fluids literature. So, and because it has a very important effect on the material's bulk rheological properties, it's really something that should be ignored at a rheologist's peril. Okay, so, hello.
So in your onion surfactants, it looks as though you might expect the top layer to move like a solid body and have a slip line across the sheet.
Oh, okay. Well, actually, that does sometimes happen in these systems, yeah, particularly in things like, so in emulsion systems, for example, what you tend to find there is you get a separation into two bands, one of which is actually just doing flood flow, and the other is flowing. And then actually what you often find further to that is that the unsheared band is rheologically aging as a function of time, so its dynamics are getting ever slower over time. So yeah, there's quite rich behaviour in these systems. I'm not sure whether that's been seen to date in the onion systems. Do you know if that has, Peter?
Which particular bit?
The ageing. Certainly the homogeneous state, it has been seen to be aging. I'd be surprised if it didn't in the banded state. Okay, so what causes this? So then we're neatly back to the conundrum at the end of the introductory section. So this is thought to be triggered by an underlying non-monotonicity in the so-called constitutive curve. That's the function that relates shear stress to shear rate, calculated for the moment within the assumption of a homogeneous shear flow. So in other words, what we do as theorists is just impose by fiat that flow is homogeneous, and then calculate the relationship between the stress and the strain rate. Obviously that's not a luxury that an experimentalist has. But what we find in, for example, the reptation reaction model that I talked about earlier is that you have this region of negative slope, and that's telling us that a faster flowing system has less stress, and that's therefore unstable. So the idea is that if we try and impose a flow rate to the sample as a whole in this unstable region, so the axis of this plot now has to be interpreted really as the wall speed normalised by the gap size, because it's not homogeneous across the gap, it varies. But if we try and impose that to the sample as a whole, the flow then doesn't stay homogeneous but separates into a high shear band and a low shear band. And then force balance considerations tell us that in this limit of creeping flow, the shear stress has to be uniform across the gap, and so common to both the bands. And so as we track this average applied shear rate to the sample as a whole through this shear banding regime, the shear stress, which as I've said is common to both the bands, stays constant, as does the shear rate in each band, and the only thing that adjusts is the relative volume fraction of the bands, in other words the position of the interface, to satisfy the increasing overall applied shear rate. So that looks a bit like a lever rule to someone from the phase transitions community in physics. Okay, so that's all at the level of theoretical cartoons. Here's some actual data. This was taken by Sandra LaRouge during her PhD in Metz, and we have a flow curve here, homogeneous flow in this regime, and then a kink, and then a plateau, and we see shear banding in this plateau regime. Two of the earliest observations of shear banding, this one taken, so actually I've drawn these theoretical cartoons as though we really have planar shear flow, but experimentally, usually the device has some curvature to it, so the way a fluid is often sheared is by sandwiching it between concentric cylinders and rotating the cylinder. Of course, if the gap size is small compared to the cylinder radius, we have a good approximation to this, and I'm showing just a small segment of those cylinders here. And so this is actually a flow birefringence experiment. We have a highly birefringent band here and a low birefringent band here. And this one is identified, so this is associated with the worms being orientationally ordered, and so these authors then interpreted this birefringent band as a high shear band. But the first really direct observation of shear banding was taken by the now sadly the late Paul Callaghan and his group in his lab in Wellington back in '97. So this is a flue that's being sheared actually with a flat plate at the bottom and then a cone that's being rotated around, and then the flow gradient or the shear banding direction is then this direction. And we see here a high shear band that's actually localised mid-gap, and so that's not captured in this planar flow description, but that may well be due to all kinds of secondary flows in this curved device that we're not properly thinking about. Okay, but these are the first two really direct observations of shear banding. So now let's write down a simple model that captures that, that's actually a very, very stripped down version of the full reptation reaction model that we talked about earlier. It's really just written down at the level of a toy model. So the force balance the condition in creeping flow is that the stress has to be uniform. So the total shear stress in any fluid element cannot vary across the flow gradient direction y. But as we did before, we decompose this into a Newtonian contribution from the solvent and into a viscoelastic contribution from the micelles. They can each separately vary in the flow gradient direction so long as their sum stays constant. And then what we should really do, according to the general prescription I gave you early on, is write down a function for the way that stress depends on the mesostructural objects in the fluid, and then derive an equation of motion for how those mesostructural objects respond to a flow. We're taking a shortcut through all that here by just directly writing down an equation of motion for how the stress evolves. And notice that we're being lazy here, we're only thinking about the shear component of the stress, we're not thinking about a tensorial description, and we're not taking into account normal stresses. But nonetheless, let's do that. So we assume that the stress relaxes on a viscoelastic stress relaxation timescale tau onto some function of the shear rate, which is effectively just prescribed here to be a function that gives us an increase linearly followed by a decrease. And so that's the steady state micellar stress. We then have to add to it the solvent stress, and that saves the day at high shear rate, so that the composite curve of both of those has this loop-the-loop. And so therefore we'd expect homogeneous flow to be unstable in this region of negative slope. And that's indeed what we find, so we can do a linear stability analysis and show that initially homogeneous flow is linearly unstable in this regime to the onset of bands. And we indeed then find a coexistence of a low shear band and a high shear band. And then there's one little mental switch that we need to make also, in thinking about shear banded flows is that if you think actually what's going on here, if we plot the shear rate as a function of position across the gap from low to high, we've got a low shear and a high shear. And in the model as I wrote it down originally, there's no spatial structure in that. The streamlines don't communicate with each other, and there's nothing to tell that shear rate how to transition from a low to a high value. So actually in that model as I wrote it down before, there would be a step discontinuity in the shear rate across the interface. And actually associated with that, this plateau value of the stress would not be uniquely selected. So if you ran this model on a computer, for example, with some noise history, you'd find shear banding, but with a step discontinuity and with some value of the stress. And then you'd run it with a different seed to your random number generator, and you'd find a different value of the stress. Now that's in clear contravention with anything that's seen experimentally, and the way that that's resolved, as resolved actually by the efforts of Peter Olmsted and Mike Cates and Neil Spenley back 10 years or so ago, and David Liu and so on, is that what that does is lift these two degeneracies in the sense that it renders the interface slightly diffuse with a width that's set by this prefactor to the diffusive term, and it also uniquely selects the value of the stress here. Okay, so the story so far then in shear banding. So I've said that it's something in effect where the shear rate separates into two bands of high shear and low shear, and along with that we have a separation in terms of the substructure. And nothing that I've said so far suggests anything other than a steady state with a stationary flat interface between the bands that does nothing interesting as a function of time. On the other hand, since the shear banding theorists got this far, having included these diffusive terms, the experimentalists actually moved on further and enhanced the spatial and temporal resolution of their experiments. And there was a flurry of experiments about 5 years or so ago showing us actually that beyond this basic observation of shear banding, many shear banded flows on top of that display a rather complicated dynamics, for example, in which the interface between the bands is no longer stationary but fluctuates strongly as a function of time. So I'll just do a very quick one-slide skate over what's now rather large experimental literature, so with apologies to anyone I've missed out here. So again, some of the earliest observations here were in Paul Callahan's group. So this is NMR velocimetry with a banded structure, but the interface between the bands wanders about strongly as a function of time.
Is the scale of that wandering the size of the domain?
Yeah, this is the bottom plate and the top plate, and it's being sheared between the top. Yeah. And so this other data from AJ Sood's group in Bangalore here, and so we see here obvious shear bands that are doing something that looks oscillatory here, but then break up to something that looks completely chaotic, really, in that regime. And this group also, alongside that, took bulk rheological data at 3 different values of the overall applied shear rate on this nominal plateau. Of course, it's now not quite a plateau because it's not steady state, so we have fluctuations about a plateau. So at this low shear rate, we see something that looks periodic, or at least quasi-periodic. At a high shear rate, we see something that looks like it may be something like low-dimensional chaos. And at an intermediate value of the shear rate, we have something that looks like intermittent bursts of chaos with then something periodic in between. And this spatio-temporal map actually was taken just at the onset of this burst here, so the last few cycles there, and then the first bit of the burst there. This data was in a surfactant onion phase, actually, by Sebastian Manville's group, then in Bordeaux, now in Lyon. And this is actually done at a fixed value of the stress. So in that case, the plateau in the flow curve isn't quite flat, but has a slight slope to it. And this is at an applied value of the stress in that slightly slopey plateau regime. And again, we see a banded structure with an interface that fluctuates strongly as a function of time, and a shear rate that does something that looks a bit like low-dimensional chaos.
Picture or an image of
Hello.
You've got a shear band structure which is not steady state.
Yes.
This fluctuation is occurring in the location of that shear band?
So I would say that it's only a snapshot in time here. There's something that looks like a shear band, and there's a low shear rate here and a high shear rate here. And the shear bands are, the interface between the bands is moving around. So it's a shear banded state that is showing complications.
I think the question is it moving evenly around the system in time, or is it moving unevenly in time at different places around?
Okay.
Is that
So
what's the answer?
Okay, well if it is, that's almost like a setup, because actually my next few slides are going to address that very question of whether it's a flat band that's moving in a homogeneous way. Yes, beer later, yeah. Or whether it's something that's got ripples along it. So yes, thank you very much for that. Okay, so that's a quick skate through the experimental literature. So now let's try to address it, and I shall do so as perfectly now set up in two different pieces of theoretical work. In the first of which I'm going to assume that the interface between the bands stays flat, but moves in a way in time, but in a way that stays flat. And of course, none of these particular experiments allow us to distinguish between those cases, because in fact they were taking one-dimensional slices and tracking them as a function of time. And then in the second calculation, I'll then allow spatial variations now, not just in the main shear banding direction, but having got a shear banded state with an interface, I'll then allow undulations along the interface in a two-dimensional calculation. Okay, so in the first of those then, so I'm going to write down a very simple toy model that's actually just directly descended from the simple toy model I wrote down a few slides ago. So, in fact, you've seen this model before. The shear stress in any fluid element has solvent and a micellar contribution. The micellar contribution relaxes on a timescale to this function, which gives an increase and a decrease. We have the gradient terms to talk about the interfaces. The only difference here is that we're assuming that this timescale now is a function of some auxiliary variable in the system. For example, it may be the length of the worm-like micelles, but I should give the health warning disclaimer at the outset here that I'm not aiming this work at addressing any particular rheological system. I'm just illustrating the basic principle that if we couple the flow variables of strain and stress to an auxiliary variable, of which there must always be many of those, like the length of the micelles or the concentration, that we can open up the possibility of further instabilities in the system. Okay, so with that disclaimer, now I'm assuming that this relaxation timescale is a function of the worm-like micellar length, say, and that it's an increasing function of the worm-like micellar length, increasing in this way. That's a reasonable assumption. And then I'm going to separately ascribe the worm-like micellar length dynamics relaxing on its own timescale, tau sub n, distinct from tau of n, onto a function that is, again, some decreasing function of the strain rate. And when we do that and do a linear stability analysis, starting with an initially homogeneous shear state, we find not only that the region of negative slope is now unstable, but that actually the region of where the high shear band would be also now looks unstable. So what we've got here then is the situation in which an initially homogeneous flow will destabilise. It will try to form shear bands. The low shear band could be stable, but actually what we've got is a stable low shear band trying to coexist with a high shear band that's not now itself stable. And what are going to be the implications of that for the shear banded state? So they turn out to be quite important implications. So now let's look here. So this is the constitutive curve drawn again. And then once we've allowed shear bands to form, we see something that looks like a plateau, but in fact at any value of the applied shear rate, the shear stress isn't a constant in time, but it fluctuates by an extent shown by the size of the blue bars here. And I'm going to pick apart in some detail 4 of these different shear rates. So at this lowest shear rate, this is now the stress signal as a function of time. It does something that's flat, and then pulses, and then flat, and then pulses. Looks a bit like, I guess, an ECG signal or something like that. And then at this higher shear rate, we see something that looks chaotic as a function of time, and then something that looks oscillatory. That hasn't reproduced very well there. This is a snapshot grabbed somewhere in here. And then at this higher shear rate still, it looks again like something like low-dimensional chaos. And then if we look actually at the spatio-temporal structure in the cell, so this is a grayscale of the shear rate as a function of position across the gap from the bottom plate to the top plate, again assuming translational invariance in the flow in the vorticity directions, and then that's plotted also as a function of time. So at this low shear rate here, what we have is a single sliver of high shear rate that ricochets back and forth across the cell, and every time it bumps into the wall, it creates this pulse in the stress, and then it ricochets back again. And then as you apply increasingly more shear rate, you actually need more of these pulses to satisfy the overall constraint of increasing shear rate. And if there are 3 or more of these pulses, they can interact with each other in a way that looks chaotic in here. And then we see a transition at a higher shear rate to one where we really do genuinely have macroscopic bands, and these actually flip-flop in position about defects that are pinned here. And then eventually, if there are 3 or more of these defects at a higher rate still, those defects can interact with each other in a way that looks chaotic. And what I actually did for the experts on chaos in the audience, of which I wouldn't claim to be one, I calculated something called the largest Lyapunov exponent. And in this regime where we look like we have low-dimensional chaos, that exponent is positive, and that tells us about how trajectories of the system diverge from each other in time. And so that tells us that we do have something that's really chaotic in that regime. So this even very simple model actually has very, very rich dynamics of all kinds of spatio-temporal chaos. I think probably there's a task there for anyone who's interested in spatio-temporal chaos to take that further and really understand the various transitions and the chaotic regimes in this model, but that's certainly beyond the mathematical toolbox that I personally have in terms of looking at chaotic dynamics.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Is the origin of this rather special behaviour, that variation that you imposed as an arbitrary one of the difference of the relaxation time?
Yes, so it's the coupling to that auxiliary variable that gives you, But that's just something that you would actually quite generically expect to be there. So another example might be coupling the mechanical variables of strain and stress to, for example, the concentration of the worm-like mice cells locally in the cell. Obviously that's a conserved variable, but say Scott Milner, for example, did a lot of work showing that when you shear a polymer, locally the concentration fluctuates as well. And I've done some work that actually I've never published, but shows that if you couple the flow to something like the concentration, it also brings these kinds of instabilities into play as well.
Is that a result of diffusional effects?
Well, in the concentration case,
yes,
they obey what looks like a Cahn-Hilliard equation there, which has the grad squared diffusion operator out the front. So that's a different class of models, if you will, because that's a conserved variable, whereas this is a non-conserved variable. Yeah. Okay, so that was the first description in which what I did was assume that the interface between the bands stays flat, but fluctuates as a function of time. What I'm going to do now is instead allow a two-dimensional description. So far we've allowed spatial variations only in this flow gradient direction y. We've assumed translational invariance in the x direction and in the vorticity direction. What I'm going to do now is relax that assumption and in principle allow spatial variations also in the flow direction. In doing that, I'm going to step back from the kind of models that I've just been talking about where we've coupled to auxiliary variables, and I'm going to retreat to models in which we're only thinking about the strain rate and the stress. So we have the creeping flow condition and a viscoelastic constitutive equation, which here happens to be something called the Johnson-Sagerman model. And this is a tensorial thing now that allows for the normal stresses that arise in complex fluids, the fact that we have a difference in the component of stress that way compared to that way. That's unlike a simple fluid. And what we're going to do here is a calculation in which, first of all, we solve this model in this assumption of a one-dimensional flow, where we only allow spatial variations in this direction, with everything flat in the flow direction x and the vorticity direction z. And then what I'm going to do is add on to that two-dimensional spatial perturbations, and what I'm doing effectively is a bog-standard linear stability analysis. So in other words, we take this one-dimensional solution, which is the base state, and then we add to it two-dimensional perturbations that are of some small amplitude delta. We substitute all of that into the governing equations, we expand in successive orders of the parameter delta, and we keep only the terms of order delta, and what that does is tell us about the fate of these two-dimensional fluctuations as long as they're still small. And what we're looking for there is a positive eigenvalue that might tell us that these undulations, that these two-dimensional perturbations are growing as a function of time. If, on the other hand, all the eigenvalues are negative, those 2D perturbations grow to leave us with the flat interfacial state. Now, there's a whole host of about 6 different papers that I could go through the detail of here, but suffice it to say that what we find is that actually undulations along the interface are unstable. And we find that both for perturbations in the flow direction and also in the vorticity direction, and we find then we can go on to do nonlinear simulations of calculating interesting dynamics of the undulations along the interface that form. I'm not going to talk further about that today, but if anyone who's interested in that can go and look in this series of papers here, including in particular actually a paper in which I was lucky enough to collaborate directly with some experimentalists in Paris who were looking at this actually in a channel flow, and we found a very nice agreement between the theory and the experiment for that case. Okay, so that almost concludes what I want to say about shear banding, apart from just a very quick 2-slide advert for something I've done much more recently, which is that because I know that a lot of people at this meeting are interested in these so-called active suspensions, where we've got, for example, suspensions of swimming bugs, or we're thinking about the cytoplasm in the cell, for example, active gels. And I'm not going to go into the details here, but suffice it to say that there are some models that have been derived for those things that are based on ideas of continuum nematohydrodynamics, but with active terms added in. And there's a distinction between contractile and extensile. And I'm not going to go into any of the details of that, but apart from to say that you can then take that model, it has actually exactly the same structure really in terms of a creeping flow condition. The stress then depends on the state of pneumatic order of these active entities. Then you can write down an equation of motion for that variable Q and add in active terms, which for example Sriram Ramaswamy has spent a long time thinking about. And then as a rheologist you can just treat that as a rheological flow model and ask what its predictions would be. So the first thing for a rheologist to think about is the relationship between the shear stress and the shear rate calculated for the moment within the assumption of a homogeneous shear flow. And if you do that, what you find is something quite peculiar, which is that actually, so this is the zero of shear rate here. So the stress at this zero shear rate here is negative and then increases, and then we see positive and decrease there. So that's something that looks like a yield stress, but it actually looks like a negative yield stress, because a positive yield stress fluid would start here and go up and start there and go down. And so that's a negative yield stress that arises directly on account of the activity of the fluid. And for someone from the, actually I should say that this has roots that go around here as well, but for someone from the shear banding community that looks very interesting, because there's effectively in a way a region of negative slope in here. So we imagine then that if we impose a shear rate in this region of negative slope, but notice that imposing a shear rate means doing nothing actually, because that's zero shear rate. So if we impose no flow to the system, we hold the plate static, then this has within it an instability that allows the possibility of a formation of a band of positive shear rate coexisting with a band of negative shear rate at zero overall imposed flow and at zero overall stress. So in other words, that's saying that a system of active swimming bugs, for example, can spontaneously create a shear banded state with a V-shaped velocity profile that looks like this. So that was explored in this paper here. Actually, Julia Yeomans was one of the authors. She's in the audience here. And that was allowing, again, spatial variations only in this one-dimensional, in this one direction, the flow gradient direction y. What you can then go on is actually to do a full two-dimensional calculation, as a bit like I've just talked about in the mice cells, where you take a sample of active fluid, sandwich it between parallel plates, allow spatial variations in that direction and also in that direction, but don't impose any flow to the system, just let it do what it does. In 1D it would form shear bands. What we find in 2D is it forms a whole host of rather exotic states where we see, so these are supposed to be velocity vectors, but they've not reproduced very well. So we see roll-like states here, and as a function of increasing level of biological activity, these states form wavy roll-like states, and eventually through to something that looks like fully developed bioactive turbulence. But again, the Reynolds number is actually imposed to be zero in this simulation, so this is a turbulence that arises inherently from the nonlinear dynamics of the way these bugs swim.
So the stationary state is unstable. You take the flow equations, there'll be a natural linear instability.
Yes.
With a characteristic length scale, which would not necessarily be the scale of the domain. So
Well, that's interesting. So what you're asking...
cascade from there to this final state.
Right. So what you're asking there is what does the dispersion relation look like when you start with an initially homogeneous flow and add tiny perturbations? So you need to think about the structure of the equation set to think about that. So the equation set is the condition of creeping flow, which is in some sense local. There are no spatial gradients in that. There's then the viscoelastic stress depends on the state of pneumatic ordering. That's Q. That's a local relation as well. And then the state of pneumatic ordering has an evolution equation, d by dt of Q, which has a load of local stuff, which is nonlinear, and then it has Frank free energy-like terms on the end as well. If you ignore the Frank free energy terms for the moment, there's no length scale dependence in there at all. That just gives you a growth rate omega at k is at wave vector k, or q, whichever you use, is equal to 0. Then if you put the Frank free energy terms in there, they're diffusive-like terms, so they give you an extra contribution, which is omega is whatever you had at k is 0, minus L squared K squared, where L is the length scale implied by the Frank free energy. So the dispersion relation starts at something that's unstable and eventually gets cut off by those gradient terms, but that's on a length scale that's set by the microscopic Frank free energy length scale. And so actually really all perturbations on any macroscopic length scale all go unstable at the same rate, is the answer to that. But actually in the context of shear banding in a rheological setting where you've got flow between parallel plates, so you might think if all the perturbations go unstable at the same rate, you won't just get 2 bands, but you might get 10 bands or 20 bands, depending whatever your random number generator seeds. And you may indeed get that, but actually if you've got any slight curvature in the flow device, what that tends to do is tip the high shear band to be near the inner wall and the outer one near the outer wall, and you in fact then just lift that degeneracy and only get 2 bands. You get a low shear and a high shear.
Yeah, so based on this model, it looked like it's very slow coarsening. If you've got multiple bands, they would migrate.
Yes, right. Yes, I've never studied this in detail, but I believe coarsening in 1D is incredibly slow. So yeah, it would almost never do that unless you had something to lift that degeneracy. That's my understanding of that. Yeah. What I do in practice, if I simulate this in a planar thing without that curvature, is just kick it to form 2 bands straight away. But then, of course, that's not really a realistic experimental situation. So, yeah. Okay, so that's everything I want to say about shear bands. So I'm now going to move on to an extensional flow instability, and I'm now going to switch gear a bit and put a bit more mathematical detail into this. So this last 15 minutes or so is more or less just lifted from a presentation I gave to the Society of Rheology actually recently. So what we're thinking about here is it's a very long-standing problem in mechanics actually. It's thinking about taking what's initially a cylindrical thread, seen here from the side, and attempting steadily to draw it out in length. And we have something called a Henke strain, so let's just think about what that means. That means if you have a constant rate of Henke strain, at any point in time it's deforming at a rate that's proportional to its length, so that corresponds to an exponentially separating ends of the sample as a function of time. And what we usually find here is that actually we can't deform these threads in a way that stays homogeneous, but they tend to form necks in the middle of the sample and may even actually eventually snap. And that not only hinders attempts to characterise these materials in the lab, because actually a good benchmark of a rheological model is whether it gets the extensional rheology right, but then you need to be able to measure the extensional rheology, and if you can't do that, then you can't have that benchmark. And also, of course, it hinders industrial processes like fibre spinning, but it's also what you want in an industrial process where you're, for example, putting toothpaste in a tube and then want to move on to the next tube. You need it to snap before it does that. Okay, so there's a condition in the literature that was actually put forward by someone called Considere back in 1885, and what that says is that if the extensile force, which of course has to be uniform along the thread, if that has a region of negative slope as a function of the Henke strain, then a homogeneous state of deformation is unstable, and that would tell us that we could then in fact have a coexistence of a region of high strain. And of course, mass balance tells us that if we have high strain, that thins the area, and then a region of low strain where the area stayed bigger. So in a way, this looks to someone from the shear banding community, this looks a little bit like shear banding, but it's actually an extensional band. So it's a region of high strain and a region of low strain that can coexist with each other. And just for use later, obvious, but just to point out that force is stress times cross-sectional area. Okay, so that's something that's been talked about in the solids community actually for, as I say, over 100 years or so now. Now let's think about the complex fluids community, and actually it's been seen widely in complex fluids also. So here are some experiments on associative polymers and also on worm-like micelles. This is a slightly different experiment, not now separating to constant rate of Henke strain, but applying just a fast ramp of Henke strain and then holding constant by Wang's group. And what he sees is that there's some sort of induction time after which then it suddenly fails. And actually the theory that I'm going to talk about will extend to that case too, but I'm going to focus only on a case of constant Henke strain today rather than a ramp and then hold. So this is real experimental data, this is simulation data. This is from Rasmussen's group and Hassager. So what they're looking at here is stretching a filament between counter-rotating cylinders, and this is a simulation focusing on the regime where the sheet it's actually a sheet here, not a cylinder, but where it contacts one of the cylinders and it fails there. This is a simulation from Gareth McKinley's group using either a Newtonian fluid or two different complex fluid models, Olroyd B or Giesecke, and he sees something that looks like necking here as well. Okay, but actually it turns out that there's a whole slew of experimental and simulation literature in the complex fluids part of the world that tells us that we should expect necking. But when you look at what the criterion is for the onset of necking in a complex fluid, the literature is really all over the place. So it's peppered with references to the Considere criterion. But actually the Considere criterion, it doesn't take too much thinking to see that it really doesn't cut the mustard when it comes to complex fluids. And there are two, at least obvious reasons for that. One is that it considers a force that's a function of strain only. But of course, in a complex fluid, strain isn't the only relevant variable. It is in a solid, but in a fluid, you have to prescribe the strain rate as well, relative to the fluid's intrinsic relaxation times. And it's also a static criterion. It can't tell us anything about the dynamics of the rate at which necking sets in, whereas really what we want to do is calculate an eigenvalue, for example, that tells us how fast a neck would start to form. And so what I'm going to do in this work is a linear stability analysis for the dynamical onset of necking. And I'm going to widely consider throughout this part of the talk this plane here, which is a plane of strain and strain rate. So it's worth getting in our heads what this means at the outset, because I use it a lot. So any horizontal slice through this plane refers to a single filament stretching experiment that's done at a constant rate of Henke strain, in which we're starting with an undeformed sample and then straining it as a function of time. So I'm going to be considering a series of filament stretching experiments at these different strain rates. And okay, so that's the problem I'm going to do. And this is the equation set with which I'm going to tackle that. And it's exactly of the form you've seen before. There's a condition of creeping flow with a viscoelastic stress. that depends on an underlying conformation tensor, and then we can write down some dynamics of the conformation tensor. I've deliberately here written that in a very, very generalised form with these generalised functions k and r, and I'm going to do that because actually what I want to do is some analytical work that derives in a very general way a criterion for the onset of necking that doesn't depend on which particular constitutive model or fluid we're thinking about. But also, of course, in our numerics, we need to make concrete choices, and depending on the choice that we make, we can get most of the popular models that are found in the rheology theory community, so Olroyd B, Giesecke, Feeney P, roly-poly, and throughout I'm going to use units in which this modulus is 1 and the relaxation timescale is 1. There's a pressure, yeah, so sorry, there's also a condition of incompressibility, which I'm assuming throughout the flow as well. Yeah. Okay, so those are the equation sets that I'm going to use to analyse this problem of stretching out a filament at a constant rate of Henke strain. And so what I'm going to describe on this slide are two things, one of which is an approximation, but a good one, and the other is an exact transformation. So the approximation is what's called a slender filament approximation, and it comes from thinking about perturbations that are slow on the scale of the width. And then what that says is that we can integrate across the width and think just about how things vary as a function of z or z, depending where you come from, along the filament. And so we've got an area profile as a function of z, and we have a velocity and also a strain rate. And what I'm interested in here is a global strain rate, epsilon dot bar, averaged along the sample, but of course the strain rate locally might vary, and indeed must if we're going to get high strain rates forming a neck here. So that's a good approximation, and then there's an exact transformation, and it turns out that it's just much easier to do the maths if you effectively, so what we've got here is a filament that's extending exponentially in length and thinning exponentially in area. It's just easier to take those exponentials out of the problem, in other words, to transform to the co-thinning and co-extending frame and to do the analysis in that frame. So having done that, we can then write down the equations of motion. So this is the mass balance equation that comes from the incompressibility condition. So d by dt of this transformed area, from which we've taken out the exponential bit, has this form here. And then the Stokes condition of creeping flow says that the force, which is a product of the area times the stress, has to be uniform across the filament. And the stress then has the Newtonian piece and a bit due to the viscoelastic polymeric bit. We then have the viscoelastic constitutive equations that tells us about the dynamics of the viscoelastic stress components in the flow. So without flow, relaxing back to 0 and then being generated by a flow at a rate epsilon dot. And then we have convective terms here. So these are the equations that I'm going to use to study this problem throughout the rest of the talk. And I'm going to study the predictions of those equations in two different stages. In the first stage, I'm going to just impose by theoretical fiat that the filament has to extend in a homogeneous way. So I'm going to disallow any necking. So I'm just going to consider homogeneous base state in which the filament's extending and thinning. And then in the next stage, I'm going to do a linear stability analysis where we put undulations along the length and ask if those undulations grow. So first of all, just the solving for an imposed homogeneous uniaxial extensional flow at some constant rate of Henke strain epsilon dot. The velocity field looks like this. The area stays constant because there's no necking. But what we have to solve for is the way the viscoelastic stresses evolve as a function of time, being generated from nothing initially in an undeformed sample to eventually evolving to some steady state. And then that allows us to calculate what's called the extensional stress, which is effectively z minus x. And what we do in any run is evolve the viscoelastic stress to a steady state. The stress is in steady state, the filament's still thinning and extending. And then we plot our flow curve or extensional constitutive curve of stress as a function of strain rate. And I've done that here for 6 different models. It looks like 5 different models, but it's actually 6. This is Olroyd B, which is known to have an extensional catastrophe in the sense that as soon as the strain rate becomes larger than half of the material's intrinsic relaxation time, the extensional stress actually diverges. And that's because the Olroyd B model is based on thinking about extensible dumbbells in flow, and there's nothing to stop them from extending infinitely, and that's what happens beyond a critical flow rate. That is mitigated by putting in nonlinear relaxation terms in the case of the Giesecke model. That's what this one is here. The Feeney P model, actually, for a value of a parameter that's chosen to be corresponding to something that looks similar in the Giesecke model, actually that constitutive curve overlies. So that's both Giesecke and Feeney P. These others are for something called the roly-poly model. This is the roly-poly model not allowing for any stretching of the polymer chains within the tube. This is the roly-poly model that allows polymer chain stretch, which again has a catastrophe a bit like an Olroyd B, and here we put in something to restore that stretch to be finite. Okay, so now let's, don't worry if you didn't follow all of that, that was rather specialised rheology stuff, but what I'm going to do now is look at the time transients as the system evolves to this homogeneous flow state for 7 of these different imposed flow rates here. So what I'm looking at here is the stress transient as we start from an undeformed, unstressed sample as the stress evolves to its steady state on the homogeneous extensional constitutive curve. And this is for this case here, which is the finitely extensible stretching roly-poly model for any experts in the audience. And so what we find here at this low value of the strain rate is the stress does something that it increases linearly in time and then just evolves to the steady state, which is the steady state on this constitutive curve. And it does that for all these low values of the rates, but at a high value of the imposed rate, it does something else. It initially curves upwards. Actually, we have to be careful, this is a log-log scale, but it does the same on linear too. Curves up and then has a point of inflection and then eventually curves down. And that point of inflection is going to be important in what I'm going to say next, thank you. So remember that point of inflection. Now the force is a product of a stress times an area. So it initially increases because of the stress and then it decreases because of the exponentially declining area of the filament. So the force does this as a function of time. And what Considère would have us believe is that as soon as we go over this peak in the force, that we're going to see the onset of necking. What I'm going to show you is that actually it's not that straightforward. So this is the homogeneous prediction of the model. Then what we're going to do is a linear stability analysis where we take all the homogeneous stuff that we've just talked about. So the full state of the filament, the area, the extension rate and the stresses as a function of time and position, this is a transformed position, is the sum of the time-dependent homogeneous space state as about this homogeneously extending filament plus small amplitude fluctuations, which for convenience I decompose into Fourier modes in the transformed space variable. And so we do again a bog standard linear stability analysis. We take the background state that we've just talked about, although it's time dependent, which is a bit different from many linear stability analyses, plug in these undulations, expand to first order, and ask whether we get any growth of these as a function of time. That gives us a problem, a linearized problem that looks like this. If this matrix here, the stability matrix, were time dependent, all we'd have to do is calculate its eigenvalues, and if one of those were positive, that would tell us that initially homogeneously extending filament would go unstable. Of course, when this is time dependent, the eigenvalues are also time dependent. A time dependent eigenvalue is a slightly fishy object, so better to do really is to integrate these equations in time rather than just tell you what the eigenvalues are at any time. And the basic question I'm interested in is, does any regime in which delta A grows in time correspond to a declining force as a function of strain a la Considère? So back to this, so now let's present results in this plane where I'm considering a series of filament stretching experiments at different strain rates. So in other words, in any of these runs, does necking set in? Does delta A grow in a linear stability analysis? If so, at what time? Or we can also just use strain, because strain is strain rate times time. And does this coincide with the time of a force overshoot? So let's, before we put results for the stability, just put in various features of the background state in this representation. So what I'm putting here is, so first of all, the dotted line is the locus of points where there's a force overshoot. So for example, if we go back to this case here, at any strain rate, we have a force overshoot at some strain, and we're collecting all those up for the different strain rates and plotting those in this plane here. So there's a force overshoot in any horizontal run at this value actually now of time. So strain is just strain rate times time. And what we're also going to plot is the location, because I said it was going to be important, of the inflection point in the stress. So this is the inflection point in the stress as it evolves here, and I'm marking that on here. So that's stuff to do with the base state. Now let's put stuff to do with the linear stability analysis, and this time-dependent eigenvalue we find goes positive, actually not when we go through the peak in the force, but actually it goes positive when we go past the inflection point. So in other words, we're stable here, and then we go unstable once we've gone past the inflection point. Or at a low strain rate, we're unstable from the outset of time, when necking should set in straight away. That's a time-dependent eigenvalue, so as I said, it's a bit fishy, so really we need to integrate the linearized equations, and we find indeed that the contour lines grow once we've got beyond this inflection point in the stress. Okay, so the take-home message there then is that the criterion for the onset of a necking instability in a polymeric viscoelastic fluid is not one of an overshoot in the force as a function of strain a la Considère, but rather it's going through an inflection point in the stress as a function of time. I did have 2 more slides to go through that in a more microscopically faithful model, the roly-poly model, but I think I'll leave that in the interest of time. Just finally to say then, we've integrated these linearized equations to see how fluctuations in the area of the filament grow. Of course, their actual size at any time depends how we seed them initially. I've not specified that. That could come from thermal fluctuations or rheometer imperfections, misalignment. You might have prepared the sample with a slight notch in it, and that would be an obvious failure point. And there's also the fact that we've got fluid sandwiched between plates that are being pulled apart, and there's a no-slip condition against the plates, and so that's likely to seed a mode that looks like that. And also actually to say, because I missed out the spatial gradient terms from this model, or any Frank free energy terms or anything, so the matrix is actually, the dispersion relation is actually flat as I've drawn it. It would of course eventually be brought down by spatially diffusive terms if I'd put those in. So it has to be the initial seeding that determines the shape, so I would contest that actually it's the end plate clamping that is going to seed a mode that's the lowest mode, and that you'll get a single neck in the middle of the sample. Okay, so what I've tried to do is move us beyond this Consider criterion, and we've seen that there's a rapid growth of fluctuations in the regime of downward curvature in the stress as a function of time. I didn't have time to talk in detail about the fact that polymer chain stretch, as in the Oroyd B model, for example, mitigates necking. In future work, so I've been interested in here in very, very highly viscoelastic filaments in which the bulk stresses dominate. But if we're thinking instead, for example, about polymeric solutions or inkjetting problems or something like that, or very thin filaments, we're going to have to think about surface tension. And of course, often the experiments are done under a constant load, not a constant strain rate, so we need to think about that too. And really, we need to do a proper, fully spatially aware simulation that moves beyond slender filament to think about how the intrinsic mechanical necking instability that's intrinsic to the model's rheology interplays with these extrinsic effects of seeding the neck by the end plates, for example. So finally, I'd like to thank Gareth McKinley at MIT for discussions on the necking problem. It was he who actually suggested it to me in the first place. I'd like to thank collaborators at ESPCI on some of the shear banding stuff, and particularly Peter Olmsted, who really got me interested in shear banding and who I've collaborated a lot with since on that, and also Helen Wilson at UCL. I'd like to thank EPSRC for a fellowship funding, and more recently also the ERC as well. And thank you for your attention.
Questions?
Am I to assume that you have a very clear distinction that you meant when you referred to chaos on the one hand and turbulence on the other?
I don't consider myself qualified to answer that question, actually. Sorry.
But you did use chaos in some cases and turbulence in another, and it suggested to me...
So I actually don't know enough really about turbulence to say. I mean, I would say a turbulent state is chaotic in some sense, but it probably has properties beyond that as well in terms of power law, fluctuation spectra and so on. But yeah. So, anybody else got any opinions on that?
It's probably best to avoid the word turbulent,
Yes.
because there's an enormous industry that has studied Newtonian turbulence for so long,
Yes.
and it's not like that.
Yeah.
So you don't want to involve.
But it's messy looking.
Yeah.
But it is true that there are time and spatial fluctuations, but the causes and the spectra are totally different.
Actually, maybe one thing I could say about that, I don't know if you'd agree with this, is that in a way there have been two communities thinking about turbulence. One comes from the statistical mechanics end, where they start with large n, many modes, and high degree of disorder, and then the other looks at it from cranking through the perturbations, for example, in a Taylor-Couette device, where you go through a transition to convection rolls, and then they go to something that looks like low-dimensional chaos, and then you crank further up, and then eventually somehow the two communities must meet.
Pipe flow turbulence, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, no, of course, because that's a subcritical instability, so you go direct to it. But
It's not linearly.
yeah, no, exactly.
unstable.
Yeah. But in Taylor-Couette you can do that.
So it's not explicit.
So, like the signatures to this transition to more complex states follow classical, like period doubling,
Okay.
bifurcations, the signatures.
Well, that's tricky because I guess you go through the transition really by. So I guess you'd sweep the shear rates up, and then you go from something that's homogeneous to then.
The case where you had pulses and moving up and down,
Yeah,
it probably does
I guess
do
it
that
does.
classical thing, but that's just for a flat interface, and you then know it's
Yeah.
unstable to
Yeah.
non-flat interfaces, so
Yeah.
who cares?
I think there's actually a lot more work on all the host of bifurcations that model had. The model with the chaos and the flat interfaces. I mean, I'm by no means an expert in chaos, as you know, so I really propose that as a kind of first step towards trying to address these complex flows. I think there is something that could further be said actually about the interfacial stuff, so I skimmed over there the fact that actually the interface is unstable to perturbations in the flow direction, so waves like that. So actually if you have a curved correct device, there are waves around like that. Also in the vorticity direction, so waves like that. What we've done is 2 slices that way and that way, really should do the full 3D simulation. And also actually, when you're in a curved correct device, the high shear band itself is a very highly sheared layer of polymer. Now there's a completely separate instability, which for example Ron Larson uncovered, which is what's called a viscoelastic Taylor-Corrett instability. So even if you didn't have the shear band there, that band would go through a bulk instability, and then that would also combine. So one of those papers I cited there looks into that. So really we need a full 3D simulation that does the whole thing all at once, I think. So that's a job for when I'm feeling brave at something.
Well, I'm sure there are more questions, but in the interest of time, let's...